A week before the earthquake and tsunami, I was in Tokyo and I was at Hiroshima on the Science Council. So I had just left Japan when I learned about the earthquake and then the tsunami, which caused such a tremendous loss of life. Up to 20,000 people died and villages were destroyed. Ships were brought up on the land. It was terrible, and it was so much so there was a lot of humanitarian efforts right afterwards to try to save the people. And then the reactor started melting, and it was early on, it was a concern, and there were hydrogen bubble explosions. The containment hadn't been breached, but it did release a few days later radioactivity into the environment. And so there was then great concern about what this all meant, and with regard to the United States, with regard to the Japanese citizens, with regard to the world on this exposure to radiation. And during that time, I was interacting with my Japanese colleagues, about, the first thing was to get the reactor under control. That was the most important thing, and that didn't happen until December of that year when it was in cold shutdown. And so there was always this concern of the 3 reactors then releasing more and more radioactivity in the environment. Fortunately, and this was the thing what the Japanese did, they did everything properly. They sheltered in place. They restricted the food supply, and then they evacuated people. And so during this evacuation, because of the concern of a very serious event, the people left their home, and there's probably about 150,000 people were evacuated on those that lived near the Fukushima reactor site. The evacuation was not without harm because there were ill people. Although this was in February, it was actually quite cold there at that time, and there was 60 to 70 people died because of the evacuation, with hypothermia, not being able to get the medical care that they had. There was this trauma that was actually associated with the life-saving efforts in evacuation. And there's many stories, not stories, real episodes, where some of the patients that were evacuated who had normal illnesses like diabetes or ulcers, and then they needed additional care once they had left the contaminated areas, many doctors turned them away. Many of the hospitals turned them away because of this fear that they may in fact have been radioactive and somehow they would contaminate other people. And this was, of course, very, very inappropriate, and the people had been screened after leaving Fukushima and actually had yellow passports saying, I'm clean, there was no detectable activity. If there had been some radioactivity on their clothes, they were showered and a change of clothes was provided. So, but still, even through this process, and it was physicians, radiologists too, it just wasn't the general, population. And so the exposures to the populations and even to the workers was relatively small and will not result in adverse effects. Nonetheless, one of the big issues that we have today with the Japanese and the people that were evacuated is the psychological effects. That the effect of being evacuated, the fear of radiation, is causing mental disorders, which are real health effects that are occurring now, not some theoretical effect of radiation-induced cancer that may occur 20 or 30 years from now. There's no question that there's still a fear, a perception that radiation is more hazardous than it actually is, and also a perception that the individuals around the Fukushima reactor did receive such high doses of radiation that in fact they will be harmed or their children will be harmed. And this perception of risk is causing serious mental problems within the population. What we've learned in the radiation protection community, as well as from the Japanese, is that this fear of radiation has been going on for a long time, that there is no threshold for fear. It doesn't matter if you had a high dose, a medium dose, or low dose, there's this fear and anxiety that is affecting you and your lifestyle. This has happened around 3 Mile Island, where there was no dose to the population. But there is tremendous anxiety even today because of this fear of radiation. around Chernobyl, even today, particularly among the women that were pregnant around the time of Chernobyl. And this fear that's raised anxiety and health concerns. And now in Fukushima, they introduced this new term for the young couples. The young couples who were evacuated with children, they're receiving divorces at a very high rate. And they coined this new term, atomic divorce, that takes this into account, this inappropriate fear of radiation. So it's sort of like, and these are real effects that are happening right now, 2 years after an accident where there was hardly any dose to the population. And people are suffering, there's anxiety, lifestyles are changing, they're smoking more, they're drinking more. The children that have been evacuated are experiencing a stigma because supposedly, they've come from Fukushima and they are some ways unclean or inappropriate and you don't deal with them. It's a very, very difficult circumstance. And this is said, too, in this background where the Japanese have the top scientists, in the world knowing about radiation effects. But even they were not able to express to the public, to the other professionals, in a way that could have a calming influence. So we need to do better in education about radiation. We need to do better even on the terminology. If you read the newspaper and the media, it'll say, deadly radiation was released from Fukushima. Hazardous radiation was gotten into the environment. But no one ever uses the term like when you go to the doctor and you're cured of cancer from radiation, say the healthy radiation. Part of the problem was that the government and the scientists and the media did not communicate properly and effectively to the population at the time of the reactor accident, and even now, these 2 years later, it's a major concern. This lack of understanding, the lack of communication, lack of education. There wasn't a good communication to the public. But also, we learned that the doctors, the scientists, the so-called experts should have a better understanding of risk, and they didn't.